It is unimaginable that modern warfare has cost millions of casualties. And such a heavy price is what Russia is now bearing. Last night, I saw the relevant forecast news that there is only 1 or 2 days left before the end of June, and it is estimated that the number of Russian casualties will exceed 1.40 million. This number is staggering. What is the concept of 1.40 million? This number has exceeded the sum of all war casualties since the end of the Cold War, compared with all the single wars in which major powers participated after World War II. The scale of casualties far exceeded them. The United States has been at war with foreign countries for many years, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and the Afghan War. The total number of casualties in all the wars over the past few decades cannot compare to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Compared with the Soviet Union's 10-year war in Afghanistan, the historical evaluation of that war was extremely tragic, and even indirectly promoted the disintegration of the Soviet Union. However, only about 15,000 Soviet troops were killed in the entire war. The casualties of the 1.40 million are completely incomparable. In the early days of the war, many people thought that Russia would make a quick decision, but the situation turned out to be far more tragic than expected. It has been more than 4 years since Russia and Ukraine started a full-scale war, and it is about to enter its 5th year. The original statement of taking Kiev in 1 hour and 22 minutes has now become a widely circulated satirical joke. The old controversy has not subsided, and a new one has emerged, namely the recently talked about Battle of Moscow. Ukrainian drones have flown into Moscow many times to attack local oil refining facilities, but this claim is actually exaggerated. Only drones cross border attacks. Without ground troop contact and street fighting, it is not a true defense war. As for whether Ukraine is a winner in this war, it is difficult to draw conclusions at present, and relevant views are prone to controversy. But Russia's failure at the strategic level is almost a fact of ding talk on the board. The core strategic goal of Russia's war is to prevent NATO's continued eastward expansion and to restore its status and glory as a great power. But after 4 years of war, the results completely deviated from the original intention. Finland and Sweden, which had been neutral for a long time. After the conflict broke out, NATO directly applied to join NATO, but NATO's power was passively expanded. The war was originally intended to prove the strength of Russia's military power, but now it has made the world see the weakness and corruption within the Russian military. Ukraine, which originally had the same roots as Russia and had pro-Russian sentiments among the people, has completely transformed into a major country with the strongest anti-Russian sentiment and the richest practical experience in Europe. In short, all the scenarios that Russia tried so hard to avoid became reality in the war. Demographically, this war has overdrawn Russia's development potential for the next 2 generations. Ukraine's situation is equally tragic, with its territory devastated and its mountains and rivers shattered. Even if it finally wins miserably, it will take more than a decade or even decades to rebuild the ruins. It is difficult to determine that it is a winner. But Russia's loss is a chronic loss rooted in demographics and the foundation of long-term civilized development. 1.40 million the deaths and injuries of young adults, superimposed on the mass exodus of millions of highly educated and high-net-worth elites, and directly drained the country's core labor force and scientific and technological innovation, reserves for the next 3 decades. The country's young and middle-aged labor force and high-end talents will either be buried in Ukraine or go overseas. What remains at home is deep aging. An increasingly closed society, trapped by extreme nationalism, has a bleak long-term development prospect. By no means a winner of the war, Ukraine's pain is focused on the present, the country's bloodshed, but also the ticket to integration into the modern Western system. The price paid by Russia will continue to bite the future, swallowing irreversible development poison, ruining its own national fortunes, and eventually becoming an internationally isolated country with nuclear weapons. Even if the situation has fallen into a passive position, Russia still chooses to carry out the war. The root cause is that the ruling class has long been completely kidnapped by the war. It is difficult to speculate whether Putin regrets launching special military operations. But it is easy to start a war, but it is difficult to end it. A truce conditional on returning to its pre-war borders and failing to fulfill its strategic goal of annexing Ukraine, after Russia has suffered huge casualties and faced sweeping and massive Western economic sanctions since full-scale war began in 2022. In the eyes of nationalist groups and military leaders in Russia, it is equivalent to complete defeat, and Putin cannot afford such a political price. At the same time, Putin is well aware of the lessons wrought by Russian history, Alexander II after the defeat of the Crimean War, the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party after the defeat of the Afghan War, has always been cruel to those in power who lost the war. Once the defeat is publicly admitted, the backlog of popular dissatisfaction in the country, factional struggles within the elite, the anger of the people against the large number of casualties, will directly impact the foundation of his own rule. Out of fear of historical reckoning, he can only continue to bite the bullet and fight. From an economic perspective, Russia has long regarded itself as an independent superpower. After the war broke out, it completely cut off cooperation with the West in the fields of science and technology, finance, and markets. In order to survive, they can only export resources at a low price, becoming dependent on other countries in the geopolitical game, and selling resource extraction rights for decades at a low price. The country's economic lifeline, monetary sovereignty, and geopolitical strategy are all controlled by other countries. A great power that was once on an equal footing with the United States now loses its independent bargaining power on the international stage. Today, Russia has a standard wartime economy, which is completely dependent on war for its operation. Military spending as a share of GDP has reached its highest level since the Cold War, at around 9% to 10%. A large amount of money in the state budget goes to military production, high allowances for frontline soldiers, and casualty pensions, generating a false economic boom in the short term, driving employment and consumption, is a typical military Keynesianism. Conventional Keynesian logic, when the economy is down and people's willingness to spend is low. The government has borrowed money to invest in infrastructure, schools, high-speed rail, and other livelihood projects, creating a large number of jobs. After workers earn income, they drive downstream industries such as catering and supermarkets to invigorate the overall economy. Military Keynesianism is its variant, and government funds are not invested in civilian infrastructure. All of them are used to manufacture missiles, tanks, and pay soldiers. The underlying logic of relying on large-scale fiscal expenditures to stimulate demand and create jobs is consistent, but all the funds are consumed on the war machine. The Russian military factory is at full capacity all day, and the continuous demand for equipment on the battlefield attracts a large number of unemployed young people. Town residents either enter military enterprises to work or sign up for the front line, earning far more than the local average. The production of tanks and weapons drives the upstream and downstream industrial chains of steel, chips, rubber, machine tools, quilts, and food, and massive military spending orders saturate the orders of upstream and downstream enterprises. But this statistic boom is completely false. In GDP statistics, a tank that costs millions of dollars and is destroyed in a single day on the battlefield is exactly the same as a residential building that can be lived in for 70 years. But this growth is extremely toxic, and it is a poison to quench thirst in the short term. It seems that the employment rate has increased and the economic data has improved, and the side effects behind it are difficult to eliminate. It is also the core reason why Russia cannot easily stop the war. Railways, housing, and other infrastructure can generate long-term economic benefits and drive all walks of life along the line. When artillery shells, tanks, and missiles are transported to the front line and destroyed by drones, they will not generate any sustainable social wealth and cannot be transformed into productivity that improves people's livelihood. The continued slant in military spending will also squeeze people's livelihood investment, The total national fiscal volume is fixed. A large amount of funds flow to the military industry, and the budgets for medical care, education, pension, and civilian infrastructure are simultaneously reduced, which will also generate serious inflation. Military practitioners hold a large amount of money with high salaries, and civilian industrial raw materials and labor are allocated to the military industry. The supply of civilian goods in the market shrinks, and more money and less goods directly push up prices. Inflation continues to rise, and interest rates are forced to rise continuously. This is the real economic situation in Russia today. Suppose Putin immediately declares a truce and hundreds of thousands of mobilized and contracted soldiers return home. If all orders for military enterprises are cleared, mass unemployment will immediately break out, and the long-standing backlog of hyperinflation will be released in a concentrated manner. The existing social structure is at risk of collapse. In addition, the vested interest groups in the war will also fully oppose the armistice, which can be divided into 3 layers of interest circles. The first layer of the core circle, the military industrial interest group. Before the war, Russia's economic lifeline was in the hands of oil and gas and financial oligarchs. After the war, the Kremlin restructured the economic structure. The military-industrial complex has become a new center of power and wealth. Military factories operate at full capacity throughout the year, and the state allocates a large budget to the military industry. Contractors and industry chain executives have amassed huge wealth. In the past 2 years, Russia has witnessed the largest redistribution of assets since the 1990s. The West evacuated the assets of legacy enterprises and lost traditional business people, and transferred them to the upstart military industry and its agents at a low price. Once the war ended, military spending orders fell off a cliff, and the huge military production capacity was instantly transformed into huge liabilities. The wealth and social status of this group of people will be wiped out. For them, war is not a disaster, but a profiteering business. Like the person in charge of the umbrella does not want the rainy day to end. Second layer, the military and local bureaucrats. War is a hotbed for breeding and concealing corruption, from the frontline material reselling, the conscription office collecting money to exempt military service, to the logistics procurement of the Ministry of Defense. The entire bureaucratic chain can rely on war for profit. From 2024 to 2026, the Russian Ministry of Defense has carried out many internal anti-corruption purges, essentially competing for war dividends among different factions during wartime, relying on national security and military secrets. Financial allocations and material transfers formed a gray area that could not be audited. After the war, this profit pie will disappear completely. So the bureaucracy continues to push the war to continue. The third layer, the bottom layer, remote families who profit from the war dividend. The irony of this phenomenon is that the residents of remote and impoverished regions of Russia and small towns are the actual economic beneficiaries of the war. The monthly salary of local gig workers in poverty-stricken areas is only 20,000 rubles. If they go to the front line to serve as contract soldiers, they can receive hundreds of thousands to 200,000 rubles per month. If they die in battle, their families can receive millions of pensions. This pension is enough to change the fate of the bottom families. High military salaries and pensions have flowed into remote provinces in large quantities, driving the local real estate, retail, and automobile consumption markets. For the people at the bottom, the war was cruel, but it was the only way to achieve a class leap and a rapid increase in income in decades, which led to the breeding of abnormal war sentiment among the people. The 3-tier interest groups have formed a solid community of interests, leveraging think tanks and the media to continuously play up extreme narratives, such as the decline of the West, the rise of Russia, and the complete elimination of Ukraine, thus elevating the domestic, nationalist atmosphere. Any moderate who advocates compromise in peace talks will be charged with treason. The military-industrial chain binds a large number of jobs and deeply hijacks social stability. High-level leaders are aware that a truce will lead to unemployment, corporate bankruptcy, and economic collapse. Even if some high-level leaders are willing to negotiate peace, interest groups will deliberately create border conflicts, frictions, and damaged the negotiating atmosphere. The Russian wartime system thus formed a closed loop. Putin did not dare to stop the war. Because of political stability, the military-industrial consortium was unwilling to stop the war for huge profits, and some people at the bottom depended on high salaries and pensions. Blood and rubles together drive this war machine, and all citizens are tied to war. In addition, a one-step decision in 2022 completely cuts off Russia's escape route. Russia passed a constitutional amendment that year. Incorporate the 4 regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson into the national constitution. Legally recognized as Russia's inherent territory, this move is tantamount to cutting off the space for negotiation and compromise at the level of law and public opinion. The territory written into the constitution is an irreducible bottom line. As long as Putin is in power, it is impossible to sign the return of the 4 state territories at the negotiating table. Otherwise, it is equivalent to unconstitutional and humiliating the country. But the Ukrainian side has made it clear that there will be no ceasefire until all the lost territory is recovered. The two sides have irreconcilable rivalries over territorial sovereignty, and Putin has no way to end the war honorably. In Russia, Putin has the absolute initiative and can independently determine the direction of attack and the scale of recruitment. However, in the overall international strategic situation, Russia has been completely passive, unable to influence Western assistance to Ukraine and the upgrading of Ukraine's military technology. It is impossible to return to the geopolitical pattern before the start of the war in 2022. This war has become a huge meat grinder, which continues to consume Russia's young and middle-aged population and lock up the country's long-term development. Audiences often ask me how the Russian-Ukrainian war will eventually end. In my opinion, there will not be a World War II-style situation in the short term, where one side completely annihilates the other, or the unilateral surrender of the defeated country. There is no absolute victory or defeat. But there are 3 possible deductions of the overall direction. The first, with the highest probability, follow the example of the Korean Peninsula, and the front line will be frozen for a long time. As the war continues to consume, the population, economy, and national strength of the two countries have reached a critical point. The United States and Europe will also pressure Ukraine to accept reality. Due to domestic political fatigue and financial pressure, the two sides will not sign a formal peace treaty, and neither side will recognize the cession of territory and defeat. Referring to the 1953 Korean Armistice Agreement, a temporary armistice was signed along the line of actual control to demarcate the demilitarized buffer zone. The essence of the outcome, Ukraine legally retains all territorial sovereignty, and in fact loses part of the occupied area for a long time, in exchange for European security guarantees. Russia is holding on to the area it controls for now, but without a formal peace treaty, hostilities between the two countries will continue for decades, and border conflicts and local exchanges of fire may resume at any time. Second, medium probability, a long, low-intensity war of attrition. The Kremlin's internal judgment is that as long as it continues to delay, Western aid to Ukraine will eventually be interrupted. Ukraine relies on indigenous drones and long-range missile technology to maintain resilience, so that the Russian army cannot achieve a decisive breakthrough. The front has been deadlocked for a long time, and there has been no large-scale territorial change. The two sides maintain daily small-scale shelling, drone cross-border attacks, and infrastructure destruction. There will be sporadic negotiations during this period, but it is only a means for both sides to rest their forces and confuse their opponents. The war has become a long-term bloody wound, and it will not usher in a turning point until there are fundamental changes in the domestic, politics, and economy of one of the parties. The third, a low probability, unpredictable black swan outcome, a sudden major change within either Russia or Ukraine. This outcome is uncontrollable, but it is not uncommon in history. At the Russian level, the wartime economy is unsustainable. Hyperinflation breaks out. The financial system goes into shock. Or a major military defeat on the front lines, such as a loss of control of Crimea, etc., triggered a split in the elite and a power reshuffle. The new leadership launched substantive peace talks to ease relations with the West, lift sanctions, and significantly adjust war goals. Ukrainian level, Western aid has been completely disrupted due to political turmoil in the country, and frontline ammunition and air defense equipment have been depleted. Ukraine was forced to accept harsh truce conditions in desperate circumstances, such as demilitarization and ceding territory, but this possibility is extremely low for Europe. Assisting Ukraine is equivalent to its own security. Not a slogan, but an existential strategic choice. Now Europe has taken the initiative to reduce this risk, replacing the United States with large loans and coordinated arms supplies. The joint military industry has established factories in Ukraine to produce drones and air defense missiles, fully integrating Ukraine into the European defense industry system and getting rid of the dependence on single-state aid. In summary, Putin cannot win the war, cannot retreat, and cannot afford to lose, even if he supports it firmly. Russia has long been doomed to be the loser in this conflict.